Dear colleagues and friends, I wish you very welcome to the 2022 edition of the Tore Browaldh lecture. Tore Browaldh was a true multi-talented person who during his long career held high position both in public administration and in the corporate world. He was heavily engaged in the reconstruction of Sweden's economy and the country's trade relations in the aftermath of the Second World War. Later in his career, he took up the position as CEO of Handelsbanken and became a member of the board of a number of the largest Swedish industrial corporations. But moreover, he had a sincere interest in academic excellence. And in this spirit, the annual Tore Browaldh lecture was established to further a qualified discussion on societal challenges in the nexus of economics, political science, and international relations. Since 1989, the Tore Browaldh lecture has been held by a series of extremely qualified individuals such as Ralph Dahrendorf and Paul Krugman, giving their reflections on contemporary societal development. Now, when we gather for this year's lecture, we do that against the backdrop of a societal development that is highly problematic and worrying. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we entered the 1990s with high hopes for the future. Hopes that in 1990 were made explicit in the Paris Declaration for a New Europe, which was signed by 34 states covering the territory from Vladivostok to Vancouver via Paris. This declaration stated that the era of confrontation and division in Europe has ended. That Europe is liberating itself from the legacy of the past, and that the courage of the men and women, the strength of the will of the peoples, and the power of the ideas of the Helsinki Final Act have opened a new era of democracy, peace, and unity in Europe. Looking at the world around us today, we wonder where it went wrong, where we got lost. Nationalist populist movements that claim to be the true voice of the people are gaining ground. The rhetoric of these movements is increasingly blurring the important boundary between opinions and statement of facts. Half-truths, conspiracy theories, and outright lies are presented as being descriptions of reality, and the space for an open, reflective discussion on difficult issues is a risk of shrinking or being eliminated. Faith in democratic ideals is waning in many places, and fundamental human and civil rights are increasingly being sidelined. At the same time, established multilateral structures for international collaboration are being eroded, while imperial ambitions of authoritarian powers, such as China and Russia, are giving rise to powerful geopolitical tensions. In this environment, the role of academia is increasingly important. The fundamental ideal of academia as a free knowledge-seeking force with a responsibility to contribute to the development of society takes on crucial significance. And I strongly believe that to understand our present, we have a lot to learn from the past. However, this should not lead us to fatalism or historical determinism. Collectively, we have a power to shape our future. And against this rather dystopic backdrop, I'm very pleased that one of the most influential contemporary historians, Timothy Snyder, has accepted to hold this year's Tore Browaldh lecture. Transitions, Empires, Time, and Unfreedom. At present, he holds the Levin Professorship of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. His historical work concerns Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust. He has also written on US history, international relations, healthcare, digital politics, and political thought. His 15 books, which include Bloodlands and Black Earth, have been translated into more than 40 languages. His writing has created a strong societal impact, inspiring poster exhibitions, sculptures, a punk rock song, a rap song, films, a play, and an opera. His pamphlet on tyranny has reached a very large audience and has been quoted in demonstrations around the world. Professor Snyder's presentation, which we start very soon, will be followed by an open discussion where you're all invited to participate, both from the floor here in this lecture hall and through the Zoom chat. And the discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Ola Olsson. Please, Professor Snyder, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Soderberg. Thank you very much to colleagues at the University of Gothenburg for this invitation. I wish that I could be in Sweden speaking to you personally, but I'm grateful that we have the chance to exchange ideas in the next hour and a half or so. As I think the introduction has already made clear, there's a certain basic tension which will and must exist in these remarks. On the one hand, it is my task, and it's a pleasant one, to try to reflect upon the past 30 years with you, to apply academic concepts, to try to make sense of things, to share this time together, meditating and thinking. On the other hand, I am, and I think we all must be mindful, that something very fundamental changed in Europe 12 days ago when Russia invaded Ukraine. And in these remarks, I will be working my way towards those events, mindful of them all the while. What I mean to say is that although I'm going to be giving a very broad and conceptual kind of argument, I think this kind of argument will, by the end, help us to see more clearly what is happening in Russia and in Ukraine, and to help us understand why Russia has invaded Ukraine and what it means. So let me start with my own title. I chose the title Transitions as a reference to the tradition of these lectures. The very first lecture in this series was given by Rolf Dahrendorf, who was in some ways a teacher of mine. I was a student at Oxford in the early 1990s when Rolf Dahrendorf was the master of St. Anthony's College at Oxford. And I took part in conferences that he organized. He was a guest at seminars that I attended. I heard him speak many times. And I remember in particular a book that he wrote, which I imagine was rather close in topic to the lecture that he gave, which was about the revolutions in Eastern Europe and what comes next. And that's where I want to start. I want to start, as has already been suggested in the introduction, I want to start with the revolutions of 1989, how we thought about them then, and where we might have gone wrong. So in Rolf Dahrendorf's book, which was called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, in Rolf Dahrendorf's book, he had a certain caution. And his caution, which was quite correct, was that between 1989 and the achievement of democracy, there would be something like a veil of tears, a moment of economic suffering, and that this was inevitable, but that it would ultimately allow this transition to take place. Now, I want to respectfully note where Rolf Dahrendorf was certainly correct. The transition was more complicated than people thought. There was indeed a great deal of economic suffering. But I want to draw attention to what I think is a deeper problem in this whole framework, which is the notion of a transition itself. I think when we use the word transition, we are perhaps deluding ourselves about the nature of politics. Because a transition, I mean, a concept which makes sense perhaps in biology or in physics, may not really be appropriate to describe social and political change. A transition, after all, assumes that there is one fixed state and a second fixed state. And the only confusing and difficult part is getting from the first fixed state to the second fixed state. The only confusing and difficult part in this example is getting from a communist system to a democratic system. The problem with that way of thinking about things, though, is that it ignores time, which is going to be my major subject here. My major subject is going to be the politics of time. What that kind of framework suggests, this framework of transition, it suggests that the only moment when things are really happening is the moment in between. There's a kind of fixed state of communism and a fixed state of democracy. There's a bit of chaos in between, but once we get over that chaos, we land on the other side. So there is a veil of tears. There's this difficult moment, but once we climb out of that valley, we emerge onto the sunny plains, and then things will be constant. Things will be predictable. Now, the problem with that description of things is that it freezes democracy itself into a kind of permanent state. It imagines that all the work that had to be done was in fact transitory. But maybe what's worse about it, and this is my subject here, what's worse about it is that it takes time itself out of the picture. It imagines that social and political life is really a matter of predictable set dynamics, where we just move from one predictable set to another predictable set. And so the argument, the basic argument that I want to make here is that time since 1989 has actually played a very central part in politics, and that in not noticing this, in overlooking the centrality or the significance of time itself to politics, we have ourselves enabled all of these undesired consequences of which we're now speaking, by which, of course, I mean the rise of nationalism, the weakening of rule of law systems, and finally, the consolidation of a certain kind of tyrannical system in Russia, which enables an entirely unjustifiable aggressive war against Ukraine. So what do I mean by time? What do I mean by the politics of time? What I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that there are three basic forms of the politics of time. And then I'm going to show how these forms of the politics of time can help us to see more clearly what's happening in crucial examples such as the United States or the European Union or the Russian Federation. And then I will move from there in the end to a description of the centrality of the politics of time in recent decisions by the leaders of the Russian Federation to make war against Ukraine. So let me start now abstractly by talking about the politics of time, then I'll move into the examples, and then I'll move into the war. So it's hard to think of politics and time together. Usually politics, especially in the 21st century, is all about the rush of things. It's about the day-to-day, it's about the moments, it's about the decisions, it's about the news cycle. But in a lecture like this, where we have time to reflect, I think it's important to take a deep breath and ask about the invisible parameters which guide our discussions at certain moments. And the invisible parameters, in my view, or the most important invisible parameters, have to do with how we think about time, or perhaps better, what we take for granted about time as we move through our political and social lives. I would suggest that a very important way of thinking about time after 1989 is inevitability, what I would call the politics of inevitability. So again, these frameworks are so broad and they're so all-encompassing that they can seem natural. And it's precisely because they seem natural that they're so dangerous. And it's because they seem natural that I have to now try to engage in a sustained effort to make them visible so that we can see the constraints under which we've put ourselves. So what does the politics of inevitability mean? The politics of inevitability is a scheme which says that the desired political outcome is a natural result of some kind of impersonal process. So, for example, if democracy is the desired political outcome, some kind of impersonal process, let's say capitalism, is going to bring it about, right? That's one form of the politics of inevitability. When Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s said that there is no alternative, this is essentially what I have in mind. The Germans have a nice word for this, as they generally do, Alternativlosigkeit, right? The notion that there is no alternative, that the world is constructed such that larger economic processes are going to bring about the political consequences that you want. So in 1989, many people in the West endorsed some version of this. There could be many versions of this, but the version that we tended to endorse in the West said that transforming Eastern Europe is just a matter of getting the economics right. If you get the economics right, then the politics will inevitably follow. And when we discussed our own societies, and I realize this is especially true in the United Kingdom and the United States, but I think the trend was general. When we discussed our own societies, what we tended to say was the fall of communism has proven that there is no alternative to the exact policies that we happen to be pursuing right now in the late 1980s or the early 1990s. And the fall of communism, therefore, became a kind of argument to push capitalism towards a certain kind of extreme. Now, in the politics of inevitability, certain things happen to truth, certain things happen to the environment, and certain things happen to technology. And I want to note these and then move on. In the politics of inevitability, you have a story, you have a narrative of progress. And in this story, people pretend to care about the facts. The politics of inevitability is positivistic. It is scientistic. People in this mode claim that they care about the world as it is, but because they're in the grip of a narrative of progress, some of the important facts will be left to the wayside. So, for example, in the politics of inevitability, it might be true that there's a great financial collapse in 2008, but somehow that won't be central to the story. It might be true that there is incredibly increasing inequality of wealth all across the world, but especially in certain countries like the United States, but that will be seen as a kind of blip. That will be seen as incidental, or an argument will be made that that is a necessary cost of overall progress. So the politics of inevitability is a narrative which sorts out facts. It doesn't discard facts, but it sorts them out, and it pushes to the side the ones which don't fit the story. Relatedly, in the politics of inevitability, there was an acknowledgement that climate change was true and real in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This was known, but there was a certain optimism about how we would inevitably find some kind of solution to this problem, that the problem itself would generate its own solution. 30 years down the road, we can see that that's not the case. And the politics of inevitability also included a certain kind of optimism about technology. So if we think back to the early 1990s, the general assumption was that the set of technologies that we now call the internet and the World Wide Web, that these things would have to be enlightening, that these things would have to bring people together, that all this technology would do is accelerate the inevitable progress which was underway. Now, the basic problem, though, with the politics of inevitability is that it moves us towards nihilism. And this is why. If you think that some larger process is inevitably bringing progress, that means that you don't have to ask what progress actually means. If you cede to some larger process, like capitalism, the direction of history, you don't have to ask what direction should history actually be going in? Or to put it a different way, if everything that is good is automatically delivered, you don't have to engage your mind to ask what the good thing in fact is. And so in this way, the politics of inevitability is actually fundamentally anti-democratic and fundamentally anti-libertarian or anti-freedom, because it's taking away from us the basic task of democratic citizens, which is to discuss what the future should be like. It's taking away from us the basic impulse of individualists, which is to have one's own opinion about the values that one might like to see realized in the future. So the politics of inevitability is a kind of moral conundrum, or really a kind of moral collapse. And it contains within it certain contradictions, which will eventually bring it down. For example, if you believe that there's a story of progress, but there's accelerating inequality of wealth, the inequality of wealth is going to make it very hard for people to have progress in their individual lives. And so eventually, at some point, this story of progress will start to break down and seem implausible. What I want to suggest is that when the politics of inevitability, when the story of progress starts to break down, what happens is that it gives way to another politics of time, a politics of time which I think is quite important right now, and which we are experiencing or have experienced both in Europe and the United States, which I would call the politics of eternity. So if the politics of inevitability says time is it's like a vector, it's like a line going forward and upward all the time, in the politics of eternity, time has collapsed back upon itself. There's no longer a story of progress in politics. Instead, there's a story of a kind of loop backwards in time, a cycle backwards in time to a moment when we were great, to a moment when our country was pure, to a moment when we controlled what was going on, to a moment when people who look like us were in charge. And perhaps most importantly, the way the politics of eternity works is that by constantly conjecturing about a moment in the past when everything was right, when everything was pure, when everything was true, what the politics of eternity does is it separates the world into us and them. Back then, we were in charge and everything was pure and good. And insofar as anything bad has ever happened, that's because they have come to us. They have spoiled our system. They have changed things. So in the politics of eternity, the crucial concept is actually innocence. There's some world back there where we were always doing the right thing, where evil was always on the other side of some border, where things were simple, and that this kind of politician, a politician of eternity, thrives by constantly invoking that past, by invoking the innocence of his people, the real nation, as opposed to the guilt, which is all on the other side. Now, this kind of politics, this politics of eternity, makes more sense to people when social mobility has slowed or stopped. When the future seems out of reach, then a move towards the past has a kind of political plausibility, as we've seen in a number of cases. And this move to say that politics is not about a better future for everybody, but about us and them, of course, we know can be very effective. And the politics of eternity, then, it pushes certain developments that began with the politics of inevitability further to their next logical state. So if in the politics of inevitability, facts were narrated into a certain shape, in the politics of eternity, facts no longer matter at all. All that matters in the politics of eternity is how we feel, whether we feel ourselves to be right, whether we feel ourselves to be good, whether we feel ourselves to be innocent. There is no truth, there's only emotion, which means that a politician of eternity is very much a master of spectacle, someone who's able to control media or at least exploit media. In the politics of eternity, the very important facts about climate change are forgotten or minimized or simply denied. The world is just a world of feeling. It's a world which has to do with the past. There is no future really to be concerned about. The disaster that's coming is beyond our reach. And likewise, in the politics of eternity, technology, rather than being something which allows us to be more ourselves, is something which pins us down. The politics of eternity takes advantage of and exploits quite consciously the way that social media in practice works in our minds, which is to focus us on the things that we believe already, to get us concentrated on the people who deny the things that we believe already. The whole politics of eternity is actually driven by the way technology, or at least social media technology, turns out to collaborate with our minds. So a good politician of eternity is not just someone who knows how to use social media, it's also someone whose real live politics work very much the way social media works. Gathering attention, defining the enemy, working very quickly, but never leaving a kind of eternal present, never thinking about the future, right? That the future is simply gone. So the politics of eternity then, in its turn, leads to a third variant of the politics of time, which I would call the politics of catastrophe. And this is where we're edging towards now. In the politics of catastrophe, there is no future, or rather, the future is coming towards us. In the politics of inevitability, the future was something good towards which we were inevitably moving. In the politics of eternity, there's zero future. There's just a kind of innocent past. But in the politics of catastrophe, the future is coming towards us, and it's negative, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So in the politics of catastrophe, climate change has gotten completely out of control, and the disaster is coming. And politicians, especially those who contributed to the disaster, now blame the consequences on other people. So a classic version of this, which we see across the West, is that climate change deniers, people who help bring about climate change, are then the first ones to blame refugees, who are very often the victims of climate change, and to use refugee crises as a way to define a politics of us and them. In the politics of catastrophe, with all of this pressure, suddenly everything is about survival. And survival, since so much fear is involved, ends up being defined in demographic ways or ethnic ways. And so hence all this anxiety, which one notices from America to Russia about the percentages of people in certain ethnicities or certain races. And a disaster is imagined in which there aren't enough white people, or whatever it might be, some kind of demographic catastrophe. So this politics of catastrophe is where we might be headed if we can't find our way out of the politics of eternity. Now, by the time I get to the end of this, I'm going to be suggesting that Russia right now is showing us what the politics of catastrophe look like, and what they could look like on a larger scale throughout the Northern Hemisphere or throughout the world. But before I get to that, I just want to make clear that these three politics of time, inevitability, eternity, catastrophe, I'm not putting them out here just to talk about Russia. I'm putting them out here because I think these concepts, or these categories, are useful to try to describe what's happened in the West or in the Northern Hemisphere in general since 1989. I think they're quite helpful, for example, in discussing the United States. In the United States after 1989, there was much confidence that our way of doing things had proven to be the only way of doing things. There was much confidence that capitalism would inevitably lead to democracy, and the democracy had to spread around the world. The inevitability principle was so strong that serious people actually believed that if we destroyed a government in Iraq, democracy would automatically follow from the state of chaos. And that politics of inevitability in my country was followed by a very clear example of the politics of eternity in the form of Donald Trump. Donald Trump comes to power in part because social mobility in the US has slowed so drastically. Donald Trump in power is very good about talking about the past, about making America great again, of invoking the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s as a time of American innocence. He plays entirely in the realm of spectacle and doesn't generate policy at all, thrives in social media, denies climate change. So in all of these ways, the last presidential administration in the United States was a very good example of the politics of eternity in practice. We may have delayed in 2020 the politics of catastrophe, but we're certainly very close to it in the United States. And I'll only speak very briefly about Europe, but I would just note that Europe also has a politics of inevitability. The politics of inevitability in Europe is the standard story about the European Union, the idea that nation states learn things from the past and therefore are inevitably moving towards an ever closer state of economic integration, which is going to bring about peace. The problem with that is that, like the politics of inevitability in the United States and the politics of inevitability generally, that narrative of progress only works if you shut out history completely. What actually happened in Europe after the Second World War was that not nation states, but the metropolis of former empires, the remaining bits of former empires, found ways to cooperate. I'm aware that Sweden is a partial exception to this, but as a general rule, the countries which build European cooperation, be it Germany, be it France, be it Belgium, these are countries that are losing empires. In the case of Germany, an imperial war. The countries that join later on, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, these are countries which have lost empires. The countries that join after 1989 are countries which have just been freed from an empire. The European Union is not a story of nation states learning and moving inevitably towards some kind of concord. It's actually a history of empires falling apart. And if one remembers that, and if one thinks of a live historical contest between empires and integration, then I think one is much closer to understanding what's actually happening in Europe today as Russia invades Ukraine. So this brings me to Russia, where I'll be concluding. This is the next 10 or 15 minutes will be the end of my remarks. So I think that these three modes of time, inevitability, eternity, catastrophe, are particularly helpful in understanding Russia, not just because we can use them as academic or scholarly tools, but also because Mr. Putin himself has become so outspoken as a politician of eternity and as a politician of catastrophe, to the point that some of his ideologists come very close to using the language that I'm using now, but normatively as the right thing to do. So if we look at the history of the Soviet Union and the history of Russia, we can see that this pattern of inevitability to eternity, the politics of inevitability first and the politics of eternity second, happens twice in contemporary history. It happens inside the Soviet Union. So the Marxism-Leninism is also a politics of eternity. Marxism-Leninism has an idea about how economic determinism was already mentioned. It has the idea that certain kinds of changes in the modes of production will lead to certain kinds of changes in politics. And in its primitive form, in its Leninist or in its Stalinist form, this takes the idea of this becomes a kind of mechanical or automatic idea that A will inevitably lead to B, right? So the Soviet Union itself is founded on a kind of politics of inevitability. And of course, you understand the irony here. It's very ironic that when the Soviet politics of inevitability fails completely, the capitalist world picks up the politics of inevitability and basically imitates it and then has some of the same problems. But so the Soviet version of the politics of inevitability also fails. By the 1960s, 1970s, the Soviet version of modernization has petered out. In the 1960s and 1970s, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, there is also a tremendous problem of social mobility, where people do not understand how a story of progress can be correct when there's no progress in their own lives, when the children of workers remain the children of workers. And so in the Soviet Union, we also find a kind of shift from a politics of inevitability to a politics of eternity, which takes place under Brezhnev. So under Leonid Brezhnev in the 1970s, an important corner is turned where there's no longer so much talk about how there's a bright communist future. Instead, Brezhnev speaks of really existing socialism. In other words, he's saying to the Soviet people, what we have is really about as good as things can get. In other words, there is no alternative. This is the best of all possible worlds, and this is as good as it gets. And then that was accompanied by, again under Brezhnev in the 1970s, it was accompanied by a cult of the past. When the future goes away, it has to be replaced by the past. When inevitability is impossible, then eternity comes rushing in. And the particular version of the past, which Soviet citizens were supposed to revere in the 1970s, was the victory in the Second World War. The victory in the Second World War was supposed to show that Soviet citizens were always in the right, outsiders were always fascists and Nazis and always in the wrong. If there was ever any mistake, any error, any problem in the Soviet Union, it was because of outsiders. It was because of fascists and Nazis and so on. Now, I stress this because I want to make the claim that this history of Soviet Union and Russia is, in some respect, is ahead of where we are and shows where things can go, but also because I want to point out that Vladimir Putin, importantly, was formed as a young man by the 1970s. Many of the things that he takes for granted about the world are a kind of updated or a more extreme version of the Brezhnev worldview of the 1970s. That there really isn't much of a future, that the Russian language is normal, that there are no alternatives. These sorts of things from Mr. Putin's upbringing in the Brezhnev era, I think, are important now. But what's interesting and characteristic here is that the Soviet Union goes through this transition from inevitability to eternity, and then Russia, after 1991, also does. There's a politics of inevitability in Russia in the early 1990s, which is partly the fault of the West, which is to say that if you just get the economic transition right, the political transition will follow, right? Again, this fundamental mistake that there's only chaos and messiness around the so-called transition, but you can get from a state of communism to a state of democracy just by getting the economics right. That was the politics of inevitability in Russia, and it lasts at most for about 7 years into the 1990s. And it shifts very quickly under Mr. Putin to a politics of eternity. What Mr. Putin has done since coming to power in Russia in 2000, but especially in the last 10 years, since 2012, has been to be a kind of pioneer of the politics of inevitability. What Mr. Putin has been able to do more successfully, more ambitiously, and I think more coherently than Mr. Trump has been to make the politics of eternity normal, to make it normal that we don't imagine that the state is to make policy for the future, but that the state is rather there to make legends of the past, to normalize a situation where wealth inequality is so extreme, so grotesquely extreme, that the few men who control most of the wealth of the country are actually the same few men or the same man who runs the state. To make normal a situation where a great power exists essentially as a hydrocarbon oligarchy, where the hydrocarbon oligarchs are actually in charge and therefore are bound to be committed to a world of climate change and the disaster of climate change. What Mr. Putin has succeeded in doing is in making all of that normal. And his politics of eternity has been one which focuses on certain moments of the past and which is meant to show that if anything has gone wrong from those ideal moments of the past, then others are to blame. This has been going on for some time, but I'd like to focus on the last few weeks because in the last few weeks, Mr. Putin has reached a kind of extreme in articulating these views, which is useful for us because it's so clear, although it's horrible for the world because these ideas have very immediate implications, namely that war has to be made. Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean by that. When Mr. Putin has justified his war, he has done so by reference to a broad story about the past. And this broad story about the past is a crystal clear example, an almost unbelievably clear example of the politics of eternity. What Mr. Putin says is that Russia has a long and pure history of being Russia. It begins 1,000 years ago with a kind of metaphysically purifying moment, a baptism, the baptism of a man whom the Russians call Vladimir. That baptism, says Mr. Putin, has a kind of metaphysical or spiritual or religious power to it. What it means is that God intended that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine be together as a single nation for 1,000 years. More, this view of the past insists that really, at some deep level, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have always been together. That's the real reality, the underlying reality. And if that seems not to be the case at any particular point, that's the result of mistakes or aggressive outsiders. So this is a very powerful view because it's so simple and it's so elegant. And some of its power resides in the fact that it's all about the past. So politics is about restoring some kind of imagined purity to the nation. It's not about messy matters of policymaking or the future or health or COVID or anything like that. It's about, politics is only about restoring the purity of this vision. So, I mean, along the way, there are certain details that Mr. Putin addresses, but they're all in the same spirit of discarding the facts that might make this vision seem problematic. So, whenever you argue with Mr. Putin's view of history, you have to be very careful because what he's saying is not ultimately a claim about history. It's ultimately a metaphysical notion of unity, of innocence, in which the facts are just there to be discarded or, if necessary, to be violently suppressed, which I'll say more about in a moment. So Mr. Putin, when he speaks or writes about Ukraine, insists that Ukraine is artificial. It's not real. It's a creation of Austrians or Germans or Poles or a few intellectuals. It's a misunderstanding. That's what Ukraine is. And this view of Ukraine, that it's a kind of misunderstanding or it's an example of the hostile influence of outsiders, that's the politics of eternity. The politics of eternity says we're together, we're innocent, it was always this way, it should always be this way. And if it isn't this way, then it's the result of some malign influence. It's a result of something that doesn't belong there. So essentially, Mr. Putin has claimed for himself the right to say what is the real reality, the underlying reality, and the things which don't seem to fit that reality, they have to be eliminated by words or by deeds. So when Mr. Putin says that Ukrainians are not a real nation or that the Ukrainian state is not a real state, he's affirming the coherence of this vision of the past, this politics of eternity. But he's also claiming for himself the right not just to deny, but to actively strip away, destroy any facts which might make it seem as though there is a Ukrainian state or there is a Ukrainian nation, which brings us very close now to the actual Russian war planning for the invasion of Ukraine. The idea, the motive, the purpose of this war is to destroy the Ukrainian state and to destroy the Ukrainian nation in the precise sense of undoing Ukrainian state institutions, arresting, rounding up, and killing the political and civic leaders of Ukraine, which would include pretty much everybody who's been involved in things that Putin would define as being inconsistent with his overall vision. So it would mean all activists of the Maidan, anyone who is prominent in Ukraine, anyone who's resisted this invasion, and so on. And so you see how a vision of unity becomes a justification for violence, because the world as it is has to be corrected so that it matches this eternal vision of what Russia is supposed to be. Now, when I say this, that Mr. Putin says that Ukraine's not a nation, Ukraine is not a state, I'm referring to his essay of July of last year. I'm referring to his speeches of the last couple of weeks. But in these speeches, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, in these speeches over and over again, Mr. Putin stresses that his reason, the reason that he's invading Ukraine, has something to do with clearing Ukraine of Nazism. And here I want to make my final point, because this is a very important example of how the politics of eternity actually works. The politics of eternity, remember, discards truth. It discards facts. Everything in the politics of eternity is about impulses and emotions and spectacle and how I can make you feel. And so when Mr. Putin says that he's in Ukraine to denazify, this isn't only an error, okay? So of course it is an error, and one probably does have to start by saying that. It doesn't make sense to speak about denazifying Ukraine. Denazification can only be applied to actual Nazis. There was a specific historical process of denazification which took place in Germany immediately after the Second World War. That's what the word applies to. But in the politics of eternity, the word is separated from its meaning, right? So if I say, when Putin says, I'm going to invade Ukraine and denazify it, the mistake is obvious. It's not a Nazi country, it's a democracy. Its president happens to be Jewish and was elected with 73% of the vote. So it's, this is obviously an absurd, it's not just grotesque, but it's also absurd. But what I want to suggest is that the point of all of this is not to make a mistake or even just to issue propaganda. The point of all of this is to push unreality as an element of policy, right? It's not an error, it's an attack on the truth itself. It's an attempt to subdue the truth. It's an attempt to debase concepts. So insofar as we find ourselves engaging with this language of the denazification of Ukraine, what we're doing is we're finding ourselves contending with this sort of phantom, which is not about the facts itself. It's because the attack on the facts is so profound, it's about our very ability to conceptualize reality. And I mean that very seriously. Insofar as we can get beyond the politics of inevitability and eternity and catastrophe, we're going to need to have access to history. And what Mr. Putin is doing is he's taking concepts from history, like genocide or Nazis, and he's making them useless or trying to make them useless. The war aim, which he has pretty explicitly announced, is to round up the leaders of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian state, charge them with being Nazis and having committed genocide in some kind of tribunal, which would be a sham echo of Nuremberg. So it's not just a mistake or a falsehood, it's an active attempt to traduce and debase words, concepts, and institutions which we might need if we're going to chart some kind of a better future. So what I'm trying to suggest then in conclusion is that we can see this invasion of Ukraine in many ways, of course. I mean, we have to see it as a premeditated and planned war. We have to see it as the attack of a larger country on a smaller country. We have to see it in its tactics as a war of destruction and a war of atrocity in which civilians are a deliberate target and are suffering horribly as we speak. But in this larger set of concepts which I'm proposing, this war can be seen as an example of how the politics of eternity becomes the politics of catastrophe. Mr. Putin is clearly himself in a kind of catastrophic mode. He's a late career tyrant who's concerned about eternity, concerned about how he'll be remembered after he's gone. He's someone who refers almost reflexively to the possibility of nuclear war and the end of life on Earth as we know it, etc. And just by the way, he's also the most powerful hydrocarbon oligarch in the world. The Russian war effort is funded entirely or almost entirely from natural gas and oil revenues. So Russia winning this war it would also be an example of how hydrocarbon oligarchy extends its power, preventing us from addressing climate change and making an actual end of the world come that much closer. So what I'm trying to suggest is that in addition to all of the ways in which one can and must criticize and condemn this war, there's something else going on here. This war is a way of showing us how we've misunderstood or underestimated the politics of time. And if we bring the politics of time back into things, we'll have tools that will help us to decode what Mr. Putin is saying. And by the way, what is he saying? When he says that Russia is invading Ukraine to denazify, what he is saying is classically, centrally, the politics of eternity. He's saying that we, Russia, are always innocent. No matter what we do, we are always innocent. No matter what we do, it's always the other side who are the Nazis and the fascists. Even if what we do looks like it's fascist, it is always the other side who are the fascists. This is what the politics of eternity comes down to. It's a cycle in which you refer back to the Second World War, so you're innocent. You refer back to a baptism 1,000 years ago, so you're innocent. The signifier and the signified are totally disconnected. Empirical reality doesn't matter. Words just mean what the dictator is able to make them to mean. And we're all cut off from values, from significance, and from the past. That is where we are. That is the pure form of the politics of eternity, leading to the politics of catastrophe. That's one larger way of conceptualizing this war. And I appreciate the chance that I've had to speak to you about it and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Snyder. Thank you for a thought-provoking presentation, giving us analytical tools to understand the politics of time. And just a first question which comes to my mind during your presentation.
I'm just going to get a glass of water. Just
Sure.
Give me 15 seconds. I'm sorry. Just give me a glass of water. Excuse me.
And that concerns the three stages in the slippery slope of politics of time. The politics of inevitability, eternity, and catastrophe. And listening to you, it seems that if we start out in the politics of inevitability, it will follow that we will get into this, the politics of eternity, where the demarcation line between facts and opinions is not there to be any longer. And that will inevitably lead to the politics of catastrophe in a longer term perspective. So my question really is, what can we learn from history to avoid this slippery slope?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a very pointed question. I appreciate it because it brings out the whole point of this lecture, which is that ideas matter and intellectual history matters, and it's our awareness of ideas and our ability to extract ideas from the ferment around us, which allows us to be free. In other words, allows us to see these frameworks and thereby get out of them, right? So it's not my suggestion that the politics of inevitability has to lead to the politics of eternity. It is that the politics of inevitability, when we don't see it for what it is, creates processes which are likely to point us in that direction. And one of those processes precisely is the instruction that we receive that there are no alternatives. Once you are taught that there are no alternatives, you as a person lose the habit of thinking about alternatives. once you are taught that all the good things in the universe will be brought to you automatically, you lose the mental habit of considering what values are yours and how you might combine your own values and how you might imagine your own future. So the politics of inevitability instructs us that things have to go the way that they have to go. My point here is to run a kind of awareness exercise in which I say that insofar as we see the politics of time, then we have some power over the politics of time, and we can make our way out. So I don't mean to suggest that these stages are inevitable. I'm observing how one of them tends to lead to another, and I'm trying to define our own moment as one where the politics of eternity is visibly giving way, at least in one part of the world, to the politics of catastrophe. And so when we see it that way, maybe our ability to see it in that larger, more abstract way will also suggest bigger ways we might have to address it. So for example, just to give an example, I think the things that the West is doing, that Sweden is doing, the European Union is doing, the United States is doing with respect to Russia are very sound, but maybe it's too early in the war, but very few people are pointing out that if we had already made the transition to clean energy, then a hydrocarbon oligarch like Putin could never have come to power, right? So there could never stay in power, right? So there are larger observations about the future, which one gets to if one can have this sort of larger framework. But
okay, thank you very much. Thanks for a very inspiring and interesting lecture. So I will lead the questions, so please notify if you would like to make a question. I'll just start by following up on Per's question here about the transitions, or the non-transitions in a sense. We know from Europe, we had a very autocratic rule in Germany, Nazi rule, which was referred to earlier, where there was actually what seems to be a sustained transition to politics of inevitability, democracy, capitalism, and so on. Whereas in Russia, you mentioned that there were maybe 6-7 years of inevitability before there was this return to eternity again. So, speaking of the Russian case, what can we understand from this failure in the 1990s? What do you see as the major problems there? Does it have to do with Putin's personality? Is there some very important role here for individual leaders, in a sense? But then there seems to be a Putin maybe before 2007, the Munich conference, and what you referred to there, and after that. So a little bit more. Could you say a little bit more about exactly what went wrong, so to speak, in Russia in this period?
Yeah, it's a tricky. The what went wrong is a tricky question, because when we speak from the West, it's important to take responsibility for the things that we did wrong, but it's also important, as we do so, not to suggest that other people have no agency, right? And so, I mean, there's a kind of hubris that especially Americans have in both directions, where we can imagine that we can imagine that we can solve everything, and we also imagine that we can break everything, and neither of those things is really true. It's a mix. So, but let me start with the West. I think I think the end of communism did come at a kind of unfortunate moment, where at least in London and in Washington, a consensus had emerged just by chance, really, in the Thatcher and in the Reagan administrations, about a kind of economic determinism. And the end of communism was taken as confirmation of that form of economic determinism, namely that only market economies were really durable, and only market economies could bring about democracy, and that the closer one got to a quote unquote free market, the better things would be, including for democracy. And there was that became an application to Russia, and not just Russia, Eastern Europe as a whole. It became a kind of shorthand for what the reform process was supposed to be like. And of course, so a misunderstanding of how the market works, or the place of the market in the state, then becomes a false prescription for how you create a relationship between a market and a state. Because of course, in reality, it's true that a functioning market, which is a wonderful thing, by the way, but a functioning market depends very much on having the right kind of state. And so the state can't expect the market to create the state. Back then, our main categories were capitalism and democracy, but prior to both of those is actually the state. And I think too little attention was paid to what kind of state there ought to be, as opposed to as opposed to parliamentarism and the market as such. And what happened? So then the Russian state had significant problems. I'll just mention two of them. One of them was that it was set up in such a way so that wealth concentration was very likely. I mean, there are many ways in which, there are many ways in which, let's call it, oligarchical capitalism is the last stage of communism. And one of them is that communism sets the stage for oligarchy by the concentration of assets in a few places. And the Soviet Union in particular, because it was a hydrocarbon exporter, control of hydrocarbon wealth was going to become a center of attention for groups that became oligarchical clans. We in the West didn't anticipate this well enough, but I'm not going to say that this is particularly our fault. It has to do with the structure of the Soviet state. The structure of the Soviet state was going to make it difficult to have a market with lots of small and medium-sized businesses when there were these assets which already existed. And there's a kind of, deep, if you like, dialectical irony to this, because what Marx thought was that capitalism would build up the big enterprises and then all socialism would have to do was take them over. And in fact, what happened in the Soviet Union anyway was that socialism built up all these big enterprises and then all the oligarchs had to do was take them over. And then you had oligarchy. And then the second problem with the Soviet state, which you allude to, I think, when you mentioned Mr. Putin, is the predominance of the secret services, the kind of mental, psychological predominance of the secret services, their definition of politics as being a constant provocation. So if you're in the KGB, what you're very good at probably is in getting the other side to do the things it doesn't want to do. You're not so good at managing the world. You're terrible at that probably, but you're very good at managing somebody else's perceptions of the world. And to make a long story short, as Mr. Putin has risen to power, that's what politics has become. He came to power at a very dubious moment when buildings exploded in Russia in a way which wasn't explained, but which he defined as a Chechen terrorist attack and began a war on Chechnya. That sets the pattern. There isn't going to be domestic policy made in Russia. Instead, there are going to be a series of events which can be blamed on other people. There'll be a series of provocations. There'll be a series of spectacles. And that tendency to understand the world as only being about provocation, that everything is just a hall of mirrors. And so all that matters in politics is to hold the mirror in the right direction. It's never actually about making anything or creating anything or caring about people or setting up rules, et cetera. That taking the KGB world and making it into a larger world of politics, that is Mr. Putin personally. But of course, it also has to do with something about the Soviet system where the secret services were so central budgetarily, but also central in the mind of people, of the normal way that things might be run.
I have a question here from Christina Reimann. Having grown into the politics of inevitability of the European Union, I was intrigued by your note about the EU being a composite of collapsing empires, which has not been sufficiently taken into consideration by its makers. Could you please expand on this?
Okay, so I'll do it in three parts. Mm-hmm. The first is the myth. So the myth of the European Union is that Europe is a bunch of nation states, and those nation states fought a war, the Second World War, and then they learned that war was bad, and then they started this integration process. That's complete nonsense. That never happened. What happened was that European empires learned that empire was impossible. And the German defeat in the Second World War is simply a very striking example of that. The German war in the East was an imperial war. It was a colonial war par excellence, whose main target, by the way, was Ukraine. Colonizing Ukraine was Germany's main war goal in the East. So Germany loses an imperial war, And at that same time, it begins this integration process with several countries, but most importantly, France. De Gaulle turns to Europe famously as he realizes that France can't keep up its empire. That's the turning point that in the early 60s, and that is true for everyone. There aren't European nation states. I realize I'm talking in Sweden, and you guys are, to some extent, an exception. But in general, all of these places that drive the European integration process, they're substituting Europe for lost empires. That's true for Belgium. It's true for the Netherlands. It's true for everybody. And then after 1989, that's true as well, but in a different way. Instead of it being the metropolis of an empire, it's now the periphery of an empire. But Europe is still basically a solution to empire. It's an answer to the question of what you do after empire. This whole cover story about how we learned from Second World War that war is bad is just not true. I mean, European countries kept fighting wars until they lost them. The Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they didn't lose their empires because they decided war was a bad thing. They lost their empires because they lost wars and had to go back. So there's a much messier story of the European Union, but this is my second point. It's much more fruitful if we see Europe for what it is, because if you understand that it's a place to go after empire, then you understand why it's worked so well and why it's important. It makes much more historical sense. It makes much more historical sense to say that you substitute a European trade zone and a European identity for an imperial trade zone and an imperial identity than to seriously imagine that a bunch of people, learned a lesson about pacifism. And if you understand it that way, then you also understand why people want to join the European Union, right? When Spain or Portugal and so on want to join the European Union, it's not just that Spain and Portugal are becoming democracies. It's also that they are losing their empires in Africa. Those things happen almost at exactly the same time. When Poland or Czechoslovakia want to join the European Union after 1989, it's because their leaders understand, and in fact, they say it this way, that the nation state alone isn't going to be able to make it. If the nation state is going to exist, it has to be as part of this integration process. And by the way, this also helps us to understand Ukraine. I mean, you might be asking yourself, in the middle of this war, a war in which you could very easily be killed, why is Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, talking about the European Union and formally applying to join the European Union? It's because Ukrainians understand this basic reality, which is that the European Union is there to help shore up states as empires fall. The real alternatives in Europe are integration and empire. So that's the myth and that's the history. And then the third thing I would just want to say is about the future. If Europe is going to have a future, then it has to have a story which isn't only about 80 years ago, right? That story about the Second World War is only partially true, and it's also a very long time ago. But if Europe is about what to do after empire, if it's about making a certain way of life plausible, then you can see, if you're Macron or if you're Olaf Scholz going to Versailles this Thursday to think about what to do about Ukraine, if you have this larger image that, Europe is there as an alternative, it's not just a collection of nation states, it's an alternative to an imperial way of being. It's an alternative to inequality and exploitation. It's an alternative to all of that. Then you have a language with which you can start thinking about why you would want to admit Ukraine, but not just admitting Ukraine. I mean, it's a language that's more suitable for the future in general.
Okay, we have a question up there.
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I think that I and a lot of other people tried to get our heads around why Ukraine. Why is it that Ukraine is attacked? And I was thinking about how important Ukraine was in the Soviet Union to secure the food supply. So how do you think the fertile soils of Ukraine play a role in this today?
It's a wonderful question, and it's historically, of course, as you say, very well authorized. The famine in Ukraine in the 1930s under Stalin has to do with this. Stalin's version of modernization was that I'm quoting him now, we have to colonize ourselves. So we have to, so I mean, the whole time when I'm thinking about the European Union as a imperial project, I'm also thinking about the Soviet Union. Stalin's view was that we have to colonize ourselves. We have to self-colonize. We have to internally colonize. And the main territory which was to be colonially exploited in this paradigm was in fact Ukraine, for the reason that you give, because Ukraine's Black Earth was the most fertile territory, or among the most fertile territories of the Soviet Union, and the attempt to exploit it rapidly, and then Stalin's decision to blame Ukrainians for the consequences of his own decisions led to about 4 million people dying. And then likewise, as I alluded to in the talk, the German plan for invading the Soviet Union rested on the idea that the agriculture of Ukraine could be controlled and the agricultural surplus could be diverted westward, thereby supplying the German people and the German Empire in Europe forever. That was the basic idea. Lebensraum meant above all Ukraine. German war planning imagined that most of the inhabitants of Ukraine would be driven out or starved, and that Germans would dominate a much more sparsely populated land where the necessary number of Ukrainian or other Slavic laborers would work on collective farms for Germans. That was the idea. So those are two very colonial ideas. And then, of course, you're right that later in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was exporting grain, much of that grain did in fact come from Ukraine. That's all true. And I'm sure it's also true that were Russia to actually dominate Ukraine politically, that at some point it would start to draw a profit from grain. I don't think that's practically going to happen, because I don't think that outcome of the war is possible. I don't think Russia is very likely to be in a state to exploit Ukrainian agriculture. But I guess answering your question, I don't see that motivation in anything that Russian leaders are saying. So I think you'd have to reach pretty deep to say that what they're saying is just epiphenomenal and it's all really about the economy. My read is that Russia is right now a kind of classically tyrannical regime where many of our explanations from international relations theory or from political science just don't really apply, because the necessary institutions aren't really present. What's present is one person, and that one person seems to be very much preoccupied by the kinds of ideas that I was talking about. So I could be mistaken, but I don't think that Mr. Putin himself is really thinking in economic terms anymore. I think the driver of this invasion is that Ukraine shouldn't exist. I think and I think it's more metaphysical than a practical economic notion. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't people in Russia who are thinking of ways to profit from this, but I don't think it was an economic calculation. I mean, if it were an economic calculation, then all of the sanctions and all of this stuff, which was inevitably going to follow, would seem like it would play more of a role. I honestly think that the only way to explain this war is to move beyond, conventional explanations about interests and to try to understand the dynamics of a particular tyrant, which is one of the reasons why I was in the mode of intellectual history in this talk.
Yes, one question there, and then after.
Hi. You were talking about the politics of inevitability with respect to the EU and post-Soviet Central and Eastern Europe. With NATO, when it enlarged, it very clearly was concerned with institutional arrangements for democracy. So it required that there be an independent judiciary, audits, democratic control of the military, and a number of objectives that really put incentives for Central and Eastern European countries to have sturdy democracies first before they would get the military support. And this made a tremendous improvement, I think, in the liberalization of Eastern Europe. And you can see the difference between Poland and Ukraine based on this. And maybe you could comment on some of these institutional engineering that was done as opposed to this politics of inevitability. Yeah.
No, I think that's a very fair point. I would make it with respect to the European Union. I think it's I think the idea of following the Copenhagen criteria, the three broad Copenhagen criteria, and then the idea of taking on the acquis communautaire has had the same kind of effect that you're talking about. But I think it was probably more profound and required much longer term engagement and transformation of the state. I agree with very much though with what you say about NATO, and I would add another point about NATO. I'm trying hard these days not to talk about NATO enlargement. I mean, I realize that it's not that it's completely inaccurate. NATO is larger than it used to be, but when I think back to the 1990s and into the process that you're describing, the only reason why it worked was that sovereign states actually wanted to join NATO. And they wanted to join NATO largely for democratic reasons, which is that their populations cared about their own security and therefore wanted their leaders to pursue NATO membership. So what we call the enlargement of NATO was in fact a response to democratization and the felt security needs of newly sovereign countries. And I agree with everything that you say. I'm picking on this one word because in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a tendency to talk about NATO as a thing and Russia as a thing without remembering that countries like Ukraine, the reason why Ukraine wants to join NATO is that Russia invaded it in 2014. And at that point, the democratic politics of NATO membership in Ukraine changed. Up to that point, it hadn't been popular. After 2014, NATO was suddenly popular. So I'm sorry, I'm riffing now on your question because it relates to something which I've been thinking about, which is the need to recognize like the sovereignty of these countries. And then, as you say, to acknowledge the processes which can lead to specific kinds of institutional reform. The problem with the EU and NATO membership is that in another way, they can be seen as a kind of transition where once you get to the other side, once you're in NATO or once you're in the European Union, there aren't really enforcement mechanisms. So NATO and the European Union can draw countries in a certain direction, but then once the transition, so to speak, is over, once you're inside, then leaders realize they can behave very differently. They're no longer aspiring to membership, they're inside. And so the incentive structures are no longer there.
There has been a number of questions here regarding the wider application of the politics of inevitability, eternity, and catastrophe. For example, we have a question relating to China and the political development in China. There could also be, I would say, that the same kind of concepts could be used, for example, when it comes to the development of the Islamic State, which certainly seems to me as an extreme variation of the policy of eternity. Could you please comment a little bit on, so to say, the applicability of these concepts? Are they general, or do you see them as closely knitted to the political development in Europe and Russia?
So I'm going to start from a philosophical place rather than a political place here. These concepts are partly here to teach us in a philosophical way how difficult freedom is. So, the politics of inevitability deludes us into thinking that freedom is a good that's delivered like other things are delivered, that so long as you're the right kind of person or a citizen of the right kind of country, or you have the right kind of economic system, then freedom is just going to come. But of course, that's not what freedom is. Freedom, it has to be a struggle. It has to involve tension. It has to involve asserting your own values unpredictably against the world, which is outside. Like, it involves being unpredictable in a world which in some ways is predictable. Being free involves being a kind of source or an exporter of unpredictability in the world. And that's difficult. It's much more comfortable to think, aha, the world is going to do, I can call myself free because the world is the way that it is. That's more comfortable. And then you get to the politics of eternity where, you're clearly no longer free, or your leaders want you to be less free, but you can say, well, at least I'm innocent. I'm on the good side. My people were always on the good side. And then you get to the politics of catastrophe, where the question of freedom doesn't really arise because fear is so dominant. And so in a philosophical way, this whole talk is about the difficulty of freedom. And so once I say that, it should be clear that I mean for these concepts to be universal. I mean, I think that they do have general applicability around the world. But what I can't do as me is build up the case empirically for the Islamic State or for China, because I don't have the languages. I don't have the particular knowledge. I started thinking about these things with respect to Russia, where I do know the language, and that a lot of my writing, in particular in a book called The Road to Unfreedom, and in some long essays that I wrote a couple of years ago about Putin and a Russian fascist philosopher called Ivan Ilyin. In that work, I tried to trace very carefully how you could conceptualize a politics of eternity in one case. And then having done that with Putin, I was then confronted by the American example of Trump, which is different in lots of ways, but which is still very clearly a politics of eternity. And so, of course, I mean, I'm not a historian of America, but I do, my English is okay. And I did try to follow the sources and to figure out that phenomenon, and so with Russia and America, I feel pretty comfortable. And with the European Union too, I feel pretty comfortable. But so I do believe that it has a broader significance. And I would be very happy if people would test out these concepts in broader parts of the world. But what I can't do here is just speculate on, I wouldn't want to speculate on countries where I haven't done the work and can't do the work because I don't have the linguistic knowledge.
Thank you. We have a question there.
Okay, here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful talk. This one is more on a conceptual note. So your ideas have largely inspired this work by Nikolai Kopasov called Memory Was. So when you talk about our relation to time, I noticed that human beings have a tendency to a predilection for grand narratives and simpler narratives. So in that sense, in the book it says that the more tribal our societies are becoming, the more we have memory laws and digital archives which can be easily manipulated, which are emerging. So in such a scenario, how do you conceive of an alternative and this kind of struggle against unreality? I mean, it's very difficult for me to think of it.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you for mentioning Nikolai Kopasov's excellent work. Professor Kopasov has a book which is a kind of compendium of the memory laws in Europe and in the post-Soviet world in the last several decades, which is it's a remarkably important resource to have. And I want to agree with the premise of your question that there is a kind of downward spiral in the politics of eternity with memory laws, where memory laws embody the politics of eternity, because what memory laws do is they prevent people from speaking about the facts that might put our innocence in doubt. So they codify the politics of eternity, but then they also deepen, socially speaking, the politics of eternity by how they affect the press and how they affect media and how they affect education, and perhaps most profoundly, how they affect the child rearing, the world that children come into. Because the moment when you figure out what you should be criticizing is the moment when you're young. And so I'm obviously not, I'll talk about Russia for a moment, but I think, as an American, I should note that this phenomenon of memory laws has become very widespread in my country since Donald Trump's defeat in 2020, and it's not a coincidence. There's a direct organic connection. Mr. Trump told this lie that he had won the election, and this lie is connected to American racial politics, to the idea that, white people are always right and Black people maybe don't deserve the vote. And this lie has been used as a justification for efforts to suppress the vote in a number of American states. And when the people who are suppressing the vote, they say, well, this has nothing to do with race. We're just trying to make sure that things are kept, strictly enforced. But the whole history of the United States of America shows, or at least the last 125 years, show that the people who suppress the vote, they always say that all they're trying to do is keep things orderly and so on and so forth, right? So then the memory laws come in, and the memory laws say, okay, now it's criminal for teachers to talk about the history of race in the United States. And so without the history of race in the United States, you don't have the basis to understand what a voter suppression law is. And so without that basis, the voter suppression laws stay in force. And thanks to voter suppression laws, white candidates are favored deliberately, and everything is mutually confirmed. So with Russia, what's been very striking, and my colleague, the historian Fran Hirsch, just wrote an article about this in Lawfare about a week ago. What's striking is that just prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian memory laws were sharpened. It's a crime in Russia to talk about the period 1939 to 1941, which is the period of the Nazi-Soviet alliance. And the criminal penalties for talking about that period were significantly increased right before Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, it's not just that period, 1939 to 1941, is a period which is very awkward for some kind of story about how Russia is always innocent and always on the right side and so on and so forth, right? I mean, Russia helped begin the Second World War. That's a bit of an exception in that story. But more particularly, during that period, 39 to 41, both Hitler and Stalin were doing the kinds of things that Putin is doing now. That is to say, they were saying other nations are not real, other states are artificial, we have to invade countries to rescue our ethnic brethren. That was the kind of standard politics of 1939. And making it a crime to talk about that obviously makes it easier for Putin to do the kinds of things that he is mean to do. How do we get out of this? I have a really simple answer, which is history. I forgot to say this, but one of the things that the politics of inevitability did was to totally devalue history, because this is a sort of painful personal memory for me, and it's kind of been my whole career has been, pressing up against this, that if you believe in the politics of inevitability, then the past doesn't really matter, right? The past is just decoration. You don't need to know the facts of the past because you know the overall pattern, right? You know that everything, whatever the complicated, messy details were, they're all forming this nice, clear shape now. They're all moving towards this inevitable state of capitalism and democracy. And that radically devalues history, right? I mean, history just becomes part of this story, part of this inevitability story. And that 30 years of treating the details of the past as though they didn't matter, that seriously reduces people's ability to think about the future, because our practice for thinking about multiple futures is knowing about the strangeness of the past and knowing that there were multiple things that were possible in the past that didn't actually happen. And knowledge of history is also a way to challenge, it's the only way really, to challenge narratives of inevitability and eternity themselves. If you don't have knowledge of history, then you don't really have a way to say, the stories might sound wrong or false somehow, but you don't really have a platform from which you can challenge them. So, in answer to the previous question, I said that the talk was about how freedom is difficult. I guess my fundamental answer to your question would be that it's also a talk. This has also been a talk about values, because what inevitability says, inevitability, eternity, and catastrophe, they all have in common that the capacity, their capacity to push the values aside. Inevitability says it doesn't really matter what's good because the good thing is coming anyway. And then eternity says there is no good. Good is just how you feel. And then catastrophe says evil is coming, right? It's coming for us all. So, I think the fundamental answer has to do with resuscitating, politics of freedom, which is about values, and in which we understand that civic participation is about values and imagining values and projecting them into the future. That may not be a practical enough answer, but I'm afraid it's the best I've got.
Thank you very much, Professor Snyder. If the policy of inevitability erases history, like the end of history was declared in 1990, and then we had the return of history, and the return of history then getting into a policy of eternity. But where we are today, if we look at the development in Europe today, are there any possibilities to get out of this without ending up in not only the policy of catastrophe, but also a true catastrophe in a meltdown of any attempt to create a European peace order? So, for example, can you see any possibilities for a negotiated solution when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine today?
Well, so let me start. I'll start narrowly with that and then move more broadly to the broader part of your question. Yes, I don't actually think so. If given that the war is senseless, then presumably there could be a peace which is sensible, right? Given that the reason, the war isn't really about interests. And so the moment that anyone starts to care about interests, a peaceful solution, I think, would not be difficult. I don't find it at all difficult to imagine a solution whereby the Russians could say, we got something, the Ukrainians could say, we got something. I think for the Ukrainians to say that we got something, the European Union has to act to open to open the way towards European Union membership. I think if you're Ukraine, and you've just suffered this completely unjustifiable and destructive war, for you to get out of that, you have to have some kind of path. And that path, I think, has to be towards European Union membership. I'm not making the case that they deserve it. I mean, they eminently deserve it. They're the only ones who are fighting for a European order. But my case goes beyond the fact that they deserve it. I think as part of a peace settlement, the European Union is going to have to lean forward and say, when this war is over, we are going to offer this to Ukraine. We're committing ourselves to this now. And I think that step should be taken at Versailles day after tomorrow. I think that should happen when the European heads of state and government meet on Thursday in Versailles. So I don't want to go into the details of how I think this would work, because I don't want to sound like I'm telling Ukrainians what to do. But no, I don't. So long as it's about interests, I think it's not difficult at all to imagine Russia and Ukraine both walking away and saying we got something out of this. But the problem is that it's not about interests. The problem is that I don't think Mr. Putin is actually pursuing a war because of any kind of normal calculation of interests. So for Russia to negotiate, I think something would have to change in his position. I think he has to, I'm not saying he has to lose power, but I think he has to realize that what he has done has made it more possible that he will lose power. Because I think, we're looking at someone who's in that stage of life and political career where he's concerned about being in power for the rest of his life. And he's hyper concerned about things that threaten both his power and his life. And so the moment he starts paying attention is the moment when he realizes that this might be threatening his hold on power. At that point, I think negotiations become possible. But we don't get to that point without the Ukrainians resisting, without the sanctions regime, and without Russian elites drawing some conclusions that they're willing to communicate to Mr. Putin. But my broadest answer is, a lot of some of my colleagues speak about this war as, the end of some kind of good moment. I don't see it that way. I don't think the last 30 years have been such an uninterrupted good moment. The Russia's invasion of Ukraine, horrible though it is not making me idealize the last 30 years. The last 30 years included a couple of incredibly well, one in particular, incredibly stupid American war. The last 30 years included the financial crisis of 2008. The last 15 years of the last 30 have featured a turn away from democracy all around the world, including my own country. So I don't think that the last 30 years were some kind of wonderful period which has now suddenly come to an end. My read would be rather that we've reached a point where this invasion is actually clarifying, and that it gives, obviously it's, when I say that, I mean, of course it's clarifying in the sense that the Ukrainian resistance was reminding us that there's democracy is something which one has to struggle for, and that there are values that are worth struggling for, and that people have to take some kinds of risks, bigger or smaller sometimes. And in that, in that spirit, I think this could actually be a positive turning point, not just a negative one. I don't think we should idealize the last 30 years and then say, oh, and now all this is lost. I think we should be saying, this is a moment to revive the European project so that its reference point isn't just 80 years ago, the Second World War. Its reference point is now. Its reference point is stopping this war. Its reference point involves recognizing that there was never anything inevitable about nation states and integration. Our mission has to do with reordering a post-imperial world. Our mission has to do with making statehood possible. Our mission has to do with supporting the variety, which is Europe. Our mission has to do with making the 21st century livable, and so on. I mean, I think if I were a new politician, in Germany, or an ambitious politician in France, or in general, I would be thinking in these terms, that this is a moment where